They gave her 5 days. 5 days to take 3 small children out of the only home she had ever known and walk into the worst winter the mountains had ever sent. A man in a heavy coat set a small purse on her table and called it kindness. The whole town watched her go and looked away and told themselves there was nothing to be done. They were certain she would freeze. They were certain the cold would simply erase her. What none of them knew, what not one of them could have guessed, was that her father had left her something. Not money, not land. A secret. A quiet, patient thing, buried so deep inside her that even she had nearly forgotten it. And out there, alone in the dark, she was about to wake it. A widow stood alone in the freezing wind, and the axe in her hands rose and fell like the only steady thing left in the world. The cold came down from the high peaks that morning. Not gently. It came the way bad news comes. Quiet at first, and then all at once. She did not look up. The blade bit into the pine round, split it clean. She set another and swung again. Her hands were raw beneath her gloves, and her breath hung white in the air before her, but she did not stop. There was a rhythm to it. A rhythm she had built over the long, hard months, the way a person builds a wall. One small piece at a time, until it holds something back. Behind her stood the cabin, one in a row of identical cabins, all of them owned by the company that owned the mountain, and the mine inside the mountain, and very nearly the people who went down into it. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin, careful. Everyone in that town knew how to be careful with what little warmth they had. The woman's name was Maren Wexler. She was 29 years old, though the cold and the work had begun to write something older into the corners of her eyes. Inside the cabin, 3 children waited, and down in the dark of the mountain, her husband was working a shift that he would not come home from. She did not know that yet, but the mountain did. The buggy came up the road slow, the horse picking its way over the frozen ruts, and it stopped in front of cabin number 7. Maren heard it. She heard the harness and the creak of the wheels and the particular silence that follows a stranger arriving somewhere he does not belong. Still, she finished the round she was splitting. Then she lowered the axe and turned. 2 men climbed down. One was older, in a heavy, dark coat, his face the kind of face that had practiced its expression in a mirror. The other was young, and held a leather case against his chest the way a boy holds something he has been told is important. Maren knew the older one. Everyone did. He ran the mine. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the door, and the men followed. And she let them in out of the wind because that was what a person did, even for men like these. The cabin was warm, warmer than the air outside, which was not the same as warm, but a child could live in it. The stove ticked in the corner. The room smelled of boiled cloth and wood smoke and the small sweetness of a sleeping baby. At the table, a boy of 7 looked up from a slate, a piece of chalk frozen in his fingers. On the floor, a girl of 5 was lining up smooth stones in a row, naming each one under her breath the way children do when they are building a world. And near the stove, in a cradle worn soft by other children long gone, the baby slept, 1 year old, his breath a small sound, the smallest sound in the room. The man took off his hat. That was how she knew. Men like him did not take off their hats for the living. "Mrs. Wexler," he said, And then he told her. He told her there had been a failure in the deep part of the mine, far down, in a section even the old miners spoke of carefully. He told her the timbers had not held. He told her that her husband had been a brave man, and that the company felt his loss, and that the company offered its deepest regret. The words came out smooth, worn, like stones in a creek bed, rounded by everything they had been used for before. He had said them to other women. She could hear it in him. Maren did not move. Her eyes did not fill. Her hands did not shake. She stood very still in the middle of the room, and her gaze drifted, just slightly, past his shoulder, to a thin crack in the wall where the cold came through. A crack she had been meaning to fill before the deep freeze came. She was thinking about the crack. It was easier than thinking about the man. Grief, she understood even then, was a thing you could not afford all at once. It was like a fire. Let it have everything, and it takes everything. You had to ration it. You had to bank it down low and keep it for the long nights ahead, when there would be no one watching and no children to feed. So she banked it down. And she listened. When he had finished, the young clerk stepped forward, and he opened the leather case on the table, and he moved the boy's slate aside to make room. Gently, as if the slate were the fragile thing in the room, and not the boy. He drew out a paper. "This is the housing agreement, ma'am," he said. His voice was softer than the older man's. He was trying, in the small way a young person tries, to be kind inside a thing that was not kind. "The cabins. They're for the men who work the mine, and their families." He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. The older man finished it for him. "There's a man coming to take the position," he said. "He'll be arriving with his family. We'll need the residence." He paused. "We can give you 5 days. By the noon of the 5th day, it will need to be clear." Then he reached into his coat, and he set a small purse on the table. It made a sound. Coins, not many. "This is what was owed to your husband," he said. "And the company has added a consideration for your loss, as though loss were a transaction, as though it could be weighed and met and closed, like an account at the end of a season." Maren looked at the purse. Then she looked at the paper. Then she looked at the 2 men standing in her home. In the warm she had built with the last of the wood her husband had carried down before the mountain took him, and she understood something with a clarity so cold and so complete that it frightened her more than grief would have. She was not a widow to them. She was not a mother of 3. She was an obstacle, a thing in a room that another thing now needed. And here is the part that the men did not see, could not have seen, because they were not looking at her. They were looking at their papers and their hats and the door. In that moment, something in the older man's face moved. His eyes had drifted just once to the children, to the boy with the chalk, to the girl with her row of stones, to the cradle and the small breathing thing inside it, and for the space of a single breath. Something flickered there, something that might have been shame. His mouth opened, the smallest amount, as if there were another sentence in him, a different one, a human one. But he was a man who had spent his whole life learning to swallow such things. So he swallowed it. He put his hat back on his head, and the flicker was gone, sealed over like a footprint in fresh snow. "Where am I to go?" Marin asked. Her voice was even. It was not a plea. She did not know how to plead, and she would not have, even if she did. It was a question asked the way a person asks for the time, or the distance to the next town. She needed information. She would deal with the rest herself. The man settled his hat. "That's not a company matter," he said. "There's a boarding house 2 valleys over. Or the church, perhaps." He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward a world that was no longer his concern. And then the 2 men turned, and they walked out into the wind, and they pulled the door shut behind them. And the silence they left behind was the loudest thing Marin had ever heard. The stove ticked as it cooled. The boy, Jasper, looked up from his slate. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was working at the edge of a question he did not have the words for. He was old enough to feel the shape of what had happened, old enough to know the room had changed, too young to know how. Marin crossed to him. She put her hand on his hair, that fine, soft hair, still smelling of childhood and wood smoke, and she let it rest there a moment. She did not lie to him, but she did not break him with the truth either. "We're going to be all right," she said. And then she walked to the window, and she looked out at the mountains. The wind was rising, and out of the gray, the first flakes had begun to fall. Not soft flakes, hard ones, small and sharp, like grains of salt thrown against the glass. She watched them gather on the sill. 5 days. No, 4, really. The 5th was only a noon. The news moved through the town the way smoke moves through a house, finding every room, slipping under every door, touching everything before anyone has decided what to do about it. By that evening, the women began to come. They came with covered dishes, stew still warm under a cloth, cornbread wrapped in a towel. They came 2 by 2 in their shawls, their faces arranged into the careful softness that people wear when they have come to grieve at someone else's door and be grateful, in the deep secret part of themselves, that the door is not their own. Their kindness was real. That was the thing Marin would remember. It was real, and it was not enough. They sat with her. They spoke in low voices. They told her that Silas had been a good man, which was true, and that the Lord had a plan, which they were less sure of, but said anyway, because it was what there was to say. And they watched her. They watched, and they waited for her to weep, because weeping was what they had come prepared for. Weeping they knew how to hold. Weeping they could wrap their arms around. But Marin did not weep. She thanked them. She took the dishes. She set them on the shelf with a steadiness that, more than any flood of tears, unsettled the room. They had come to comfort a breaking woman. They found instead a woman who was very, very still. And stillness, in a town that survived on noise and motion and the constant work of staying alive. Stillness was a thing people did not know how to read. They mistook it for shock. They mistook it for a grief so deep it had not yet surfaced. They did not know they were looking at a mind that had already left the room, a mind that was somewhere else entirely, walking the walls of the cabin in its imagination, feeling for every place the cold got in. They left, one by one, back to their own warm cabins. Back to husbands who would come up from the mountain that night smelling of cold rock and still blessedly alive. The next day, fewer came. The day after that, none. It was not cruelty. Marin understood that. These were not cruel people. They were tired people on the edge of a hard winter, each of them doing the same desperate counting in the dark of their own minds. How much wood? How much flour? How many mouths? There was no spare room. There was no spare warmth. There was no spare anything in a place built to take everything a body had and give back only just enough to send it down the shaft again the next morning. So the town did the only thing it knew how to do. It looked away. It is a quiet thing, being looked away from. There is no slammed door, no harsh word, just a slow turning of faces until one day a woman walks through the center of the place where she has lived for years and finds that she has somehow already left it, that she is already a story people tell in the past tense. Marin felt it most clearly at the store. She had walked the half-mile through the deepening cold, the baby bound against her chest beneath her coat, to spend the last of what she had on the things that keep: flour, beans, a slab of salted pork. The keeper of the store had known her for years. He had weighed her flour and joked with her children, and once, when Jasper was sick, had quietly added an extra measure of sugar to her order and said nothing about it. Now he would not look at her. He polished the counter. It was already clean. He polished it anyway, because his hands needed something to do that was not meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry, Marin," he said. "The account's been closed." Word came down. He swallowed. "It's cash now. From here on." He did not say whose word had come down. He did not have to. And there it was, the thing beneath the thing. Not a fist, not a shout, just a ledger, quietly closed, a small administrative cruelty designed to do its work slowly, in the cold, where no one would have to watch it finish. The little purse on her table would not last a week. It was meant to send her away before the snow could trap her, and before the town could be made to feel what was being done. Marin paid for what she could. She said, "Thank you." She walked back out into the wind with her children and her small sack of flour, and she did not let them see her face change. Because it did not change. She had decided somewhere on the road that it would not. She would not give the cold the satisfaction. That night, after the children slept, Marin sat alone by the dying stove, and she did not pack. This is the thing the town would never have believed if they had been able to see through her walls. She did not fold the clothes. She did not look for a wagon. She did not write to the boarding house 2 valleys over, or kneel at the church, or do any of the things a woman in her position was expected to do. Instead, she observed, she walked the inside of the cabin with a single candle, and she held her hand near the walls, low and high, feeling for the places where the cold reached in. She found them. She noted them, the way her father had taught her to note things, long ago, in another life. Not with anger, but with attention. She picked up a split of pine and weighed it in her hand and thought about how fast it burned and how fast its heat fled up the chimney and out into the night. She thought about flour, about what it gave a body and how long. She thought about beans. She thought about the children asleep in the next room and the breath of the baby and the long arithmetic of nights between now and spring. The town thought she was frozen with grief. She was not frozen. She was calculating. And somewhere in the deep part of that night, as the wind leaned against the cabin and the salt snow hissed against the glass, a memory rose in her. It rose the way the most important things always rise, not when you call for them, but when you have gone quiet enough and emptied enough that there is finally room for them to come. It was a memory of a walk. A year before, on a rare day of rest, her husband Silas had taken her hand. He had led her and the children up along a small creek that ran down off the mountain, away from the soot and the noise of the mine, into a stand of dark old firs. And there, half hidden in the trees, had stood a ruin, an old mill, a great structure of stone built long before the company came, built by men who knew how to make a thing that would last. Its roof had fallen in places. Its windows were empty. But its walls were stone, thick as a man is tall, near the base. Granite, hauled up out of the mountain's own body. Silas had pushed open the heavy door, and they had stepped inside into a cool, dim, dust-smelling quiet. And in the center of the floor, like something left on an altar, sat two great round stones, millstones, each one wider than a man could reach across, each one a foot thick, each one carved long ago to grind grain into the bread that kept a valley alive. Silas had laid his hand flat on the top one, and he had smiled at her, and his voice had echoed in the stone room. They say a place like this holds the cold out in summer and holds the warmth in come winter, he had said. Solid rock, Marin. He had given the stone a slow pat, the way a man pats the flank of an animal he trusts. Takes a long, long time to change its mind. She had not thought of it again, not once in all the months since, but now, sitting alone in a dying cabin she had 4 days left to leave, the memory did not come back to her as comfort. It came back as a drawing, a plan, because the words Silas had said, the words he had thought were nothing, just an old man saying repeated to a wife on a walk. Those words belonged to someone else first. They belonged to her father, and her father had not spoken them as a saying. He had spoken them as a law of the world. He had been a miller, a man who spent his life inside great stone buildings, turning the patient force of water into the substance of bread. He had raised his daughter in the space between the turning of the wheel and the cool of the granite walls. And he had taught her things, not as lessons exactly, but the way a person teaches you to breathe, so quietly that you do not know you are learning until one day you need it and find that it is already inside you. He used to say that wood was quick to anger and quick to forgive. It gave its heat all at once, and then it was gone. But stone, he said, stone was slow. Stone was patient. Stone did not burn. But stone remembered burning. Give it warmth across a long day, and it would hand that warmth back to you across a long night, slow and steady, and without complaint. He had taken her hand once, when she was a girl, and pressed it flat against a block of granite that had sat in the sun all morning. "Feel that?" he had said, and she had felt it. The deep, stored warmth soaking back into her small palm. "That's the sun's work, kept," he had told her. "The stone didn't make it. The stone just held it, wouldn't let it go." His voice had dropped the way it did when he was telling her something he wanted her to keep. "Remember that when you're cold someday. You don't have to fight the winter, Marin. You can't win that fight. Nobody can." He had closed her small fingers over the warm stone. "You just have to build a place where the warmth is allowed to stay." She had been a child She had not known she was being given the thing that would one day save her children's lives. Now, in the cold dark of the cabin, 29 years old, a widow, with 3 sleeping children and a purse that would not last the week, she understood. The town saw a problem with no answer. But the town did not have her father's voice inside it. The town did not know about the stone. Maren rose from her chair. She went to the window one last time, and she looked out, not east, toward the road, toward the boarding house and the church, and the safe expected places a beaten woman was supposed to go. She looked north, up the creek, toward the dark stand of firs where a ruin of granite stood waiting in the snow, its great stones holding their patience, holding their silence, holding... She was almost certain now. The one thing the whole valley would soon be dying for. It was a mad thought. She knew that. To take 3 small children, in the teeth of the hardest winter the mountains had shown in years, away from the town and into an abandoned ruin with no roof and no door and no fire. A sane woman would not. A safe woman would not. But safety was no longer on the table. Safety had walked out the door that morning in a heavy, dark coat and a freshly settled hat. What remained was a choice between 2 kinds of risk. The slow, certain erasure the town had planned for her. A woman and her children quietly removed, like the machinery, when their purpose was spent, or a wild, knife-bright gamble on the one thing she truly knew. On stone, on her father, on herself. Maren stood at the window a long time, and the snow came down, and the candle burned low behind her, and somewhere in the dark the baby stirred and settled again. And then, very quietly, so quietly that the sleeping children did not hear, she said the only word she had spoken aloud all night. "We're not going east." She turned from the window. And in the morning, when the boy woke and asked her where they were going, because children always ask, and they always know more than you think, she would not tell him the truth of it. Not yet. Not the cold of it. Not the danger. She would kneel down to his level, and she would smooth his hair, and she would tell him they were going on an adventure. To a house made of stone. A strong house. The strongest house in the whole valley. And she would not be lying. Because somewhere up the frozen creek, in the dark and the silence, the stone was already waiting for her, the way it had waited for years. Patient and unmoved, and full of a warmth that no one in that whole forgetful town had ever once thought to ask it for. She had 4 days. It would have to be enough. By first light, the snow had thinned to a fine, drifting veil, and a woman stood in the door of a cabin that was no longer hers, looking north. She had not slept. There had been too much to weigh, and too little night to weigh it in. Now the children were waking, and Maren turned from the door, and she became, in an instant, something other than the woman who had stood alone all night doing arithmetic with the dark. She became their mother. "Up," she said softly. "Up, my loves. We've got somewhere to be." Jasper sat up first, blinking, his hair wild from sleep. Della curled tighter, the way small girls do, bargaining with the morning, and the baby, Asa, stirred in his cradle and made his small waking sounds. The sounds that meant the day had to begin, whether the world was kind or not. "Where are we going?" Jasper asked. There it was. The question. Marin knelt in front of him. She did not hurry it. She had learned with children that what you say matters less than how still you are when you say it. On an adventure, she told him, to a house made of stone. His eyes went wide. A stone house? The strongest house in the whole valley, she said. Walls this thick. She held her hands apart, wide as a doorway. Nothing gets through walls like that. Not the wind, not the cold, not anything. It was not a lie. That was the thing she held on to. It was not a lie. She did not pack their clothes. This was the first hard decision of many, and she made it the way she would make all the others, quickly and without letting the children see the cost of it. Clothes could be replaced. Warmth could not. So into the great grain sack went the things that keep a body alive. The flour, the beans, the pork, wrapped tight, the iron skillet, and the pot, and the tin plates worn soft at the edges. Every blanket they owned, the quilt her own mother had made a lifetime ago in some warmer place, and from the woodshed, 2 things her husband had left behind, his axe and his saw. She held the axe a moment longer than she needed to. Then she put it in the sack with the rest. The last thing she took down from the wall was a small thing, a plain thing, a thermometer, the kind that hangs by a door and tells you, without opinion or mercy, exactly how cold the world has become. Most people would have left it. Marin wrapped it in a cloth like it was made of glass, because it was, and because of everything in that cabin. It was the one object that would never lie to her. The walk was not far, less than a mile, up along the frozen creek. But a mile is a different thing with a baby bound to your chest and a 5-year-old's hand in yours, and a 7-year-old breaking trail ahead of you through snow that came to his knees. A mile is a different thing when the wind comes down the creek to meet you and finds every gap in your coat and reminds you, with each step, exactly what you are walking into. It took the better part of an hour. Della cried once from the cold. And Marin stopped and crouched and put her own scarf around the girl's small neck and gave up her warmth without a word, because that is what a mother does, and does again, and does as many times as it takes. And then they came around the last stand of furs. And there it stood. The mill. Just as she remembered it, a great gray fortress of stone against the pale and bottomless sky. The roof had fallen in one corner, and the wind moaned through the empty eyes of its windows. But the walls stood. They had stood through more winters than anyone living could count. They would stand through this one. That's it, Jasper breathed. That's the stone house. That's it, Marin said, and for just a moment, looking at that ruin, that impossible, roofless, doorless ruin that she had brought her 3 children to in the teeth of the cold, even she felt the fear rise up in her throat. But fear was a luxury, like grief. She swallowed it down, and she got to work. The inside of the mill was a cavern, too vast to ever heat. The cold lived in it the way cold lives in a cave, deep and settled and old. Their breath smoked in the dimness. The great machinery loomed in the shadows. Wheels and gears and belts, all of it frozen still, long abandoned. A weaker woman would have looked at that vastness and despaired. Marin looked at it and began, immediately, to make it smaller. because that was the first thing her father had taught her, though he had never said it in words. You do not fight the whole cold. You cannot. The cold is bigger than you and older, and it does not tire. What you do instead is you choose a small piece of the world, and you make that piece yours, and you defend it with everything you have. In one corner of the great floor, beside an old stone hearth, there was a small room, 10 feet perhaps by 12. It had been an office once, walled with the same thick granite as the rest. Its door was long gone. Its single window was a gaping hole open to the wind. It was small. Small was good. Small could be held. This, she told the children, is going to be our room. The work that followed went on for hours, and it went on at a pace that, later, Marin herself would not quite believe. She had not known she had it in her. But there is a strength that comes to a person only when there is no one else to do the thing. A strength that does not feel like strength while it is happening. It only feels like the next task. And the next. And the next. The first thing was the wind. A sealed room, her father used to say, is the beginning of everything. You cannot warm a room the wind walks through. You might as well try to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. So she sealed it. She sent the children out, not for fire, but for branches, for pine boughs and dead grass, and anything that would hold still air. Still air, her father had told her once, is the best blanket there is. It is not the wool that keeps you warm. It is the air the wool holds and keeps from moving. She had been a girl when he told her that. She had not understood it. She understood it now, on her knees in a freezing ruin, packing dead grass into a wall. She took the axe to the rotted frame of the window, and she cleared it down to the stone. And then, from the creek bank, she dug up the cold gray mud, and she mixed it with the dead grass and torn scraps of old grain sacks, and she made a thick, heavy plaster of it. Handful by handful, she packed it into the window. She built the wall back where the wind had been, and then, near the center of the opening, she did something that had nothing to do with warmth, and everything to do with surviving the long dark that was coming. She set a single small pane of glass into the mud. She had found it among the wreckage, a broken piece of an old crate window, no bigger than her 2 hands. It let in almost no light. It would do nothing for the heat. But it was an eye, a single eye, looking out at the world, because a person, her father used to say, can endure a great deal of dark, so long as they can still see a little light. And a child, especially, needs to know that the world outside the wall is still there, still turning, still waiting for them. So she gave her children a window, one small eye, in a wall of mud and stone. The doorway came next. She framed a rough door from old fallen timbers, and she hung it as best she could, and she packed the gaps with the same mud and grass plaster until the wind that had owned that room for 10 years was, for the first time, shut outside. And then she stopped, and she did the thing that nearly every person forgets, and that her father had warned her never to forget. She made a hole, because a room sealed too well, with a fire inside it, is not a shelter. It is a tomb. The fire has to breathe, her father had told her once, his hand on her shoulder, his voice low and serious in a way it rarely was. Same as you do. You seal a room up tight and put a fire in it, and that fire will quietly take all the good air and give you back the bad, and you'll never feel it happen. You'll just get sleepy, and then you won't wake up." He had looked at her hard. "Always give the fire its own window, Maren. Always. Even when you're freezing. Especially when you're freezing." She had never forgotten the way he said it. So now, near the top of her sealed wall, with great effort, she worked a length of rusted iron pipe she had found in the machinery through the mud. A small chimney. A throat for the breath of a fire that did not yet exist. She made the hole on purpose, because the man who taught her had made sure she would. Now she needed a heart. If fire needs a place to live, and an open flame in a stone ruin would burn fast and give little, and ask for fuel she did not have to spare, she needed something that would hold the fire, something with mass, something that would take the quick heat of a flame and turn it into slow, steady warmth. She found it lying on its side in the dark, the old gear mechanism from the grain elevator. A great tangle of iron, heavy as a stove, hollow in its center where the gears had turned. She did not see a broken machine. She saw a firebox. It took everything she and Jasper had to roll it. The boy was 7 and small for it, but he set his shoulder against the iron and he pushed, his face red with the effort, and he did not complain, because somewhere in the last 2 days, he had stopped being only a child. They rolled it, inch by stubborn inch, into the center of their small stone room. The hollows in the iron would hold the fire. The mass of the iron would drink the heat and hold it, and give it back slow. A stove made of a thing that was never meant to be one. And then there was the fuel. This was the second secret, the one almost no one knew, the one her father had shown her on an afternoon so ordinary she had nearly let it slip away forever. The floor of the mill was covered in what looked, to any other eye, like dirt. A thick, soft layer of it, settled over years. But Maren knelt and ran her fingers through it, and knew it for what it was, not dirt. The leavings of a working mill, the fine dust of ground grain, the crushed hulls, the chaff. 10 years of it, settled deep. Her father's voice came to her, clear as the day he had said it. She had been cleaning the grain elevator, and he had scooped up a handful of just such dust and let it drift through his fingers like something almost weightless. "Most folks call this waste," he had said. "Sweep it out. Throw it away." He had let the last of it fall. "But there's more heat hiding in a barrel of this than in a whole cord of pine, if you know how to ask for it." She had not believed him, so he had shown her. "The dust on its own," he explained, "burns too fast. A flash, a flare, and it is gone. You cannot warm a room with a flash. But press it, give it shape, and wait, and deny it air, and that same dust will burn low, and slow, and steady. For hours, a fire small enough to hold in your 2 hands, and patient enough to last the night." He had wet a handful and pressed it into a small hard brick, and set it in the stove that evening. And it had not flamed. It had glowed. A deep, even orange glow, throwing off a steady warmth that lasted until morning. She had been a child. She had thought it was a kind of magic. It was not magic. It was only the world doing what the world does for anyone who has learned how to ask. Now, kneeling in the cold, Maren gathered the dust by the armful. She mixed it with snowmelt into a thick, dark paste, and with her bare hands Red and aching, she pressed it into bricks, dozens of them, and laid them out along a stone ledge to dry in the cold, dry air. Fuel, made from the floor, made from nothing, made from a thing the whole world had thrown away. But all of this, the sealed room, the iron heart, the bricks of pressed dust, all of it was only the beginning, because none of it was the real plan. The real plan stood out in the center of the great cold floor, exactly where it had stood for longer than anyone alive could remember. The millstone, the great upper stone, the runner, 4 feet across, a foot thick, near a ton of solid carved granite, sitting in the dim like something asleep. That was the heart of it, not the iron stove. The iron was only the match. The millstone was the fire that would not go out. Because here was what her father had truly given her on a sun-warmed morning a lifetime ago, with her small hand pressed flat against a block of stone. Stone does not make heat. It keeps it. So Marin's plan was simple, and it was brutal. And it was the only chance her children had. By day she would burn her fuel hot, not to warm the room, not really, but to pour heat, hour after hour, into that great patient stone, to soak it the way the sun had soaked the granite of her childhood, to fill it with warmth the way you fill a well. And by night, when the fuel was banked low to save it, the stone would give that warmth back, slow, steady, for hours, a silent, glowing heart, warming her children from the outside in, long after the flames had gone to embers. That was the whole of it. Heat the stone by day. Let the stone hold them by night. A woman, 3 children, and 1,000 pounds of granite against the longest dark the valley had ever known. As the light failed outside, the wind began to rise again, and this time it did not moan. It screamed. Marin stood in the small sealed room, and she looked at the iron heart she had built, and the bricks drying on the ledge, and the great stone waiting in the dark beyond the door. And she struck a light. She set the first brick burning in the hollow of the iron. It caught. It smoldered. And then, slowly, beautifully, it began to glow. A deep orange in the dark. She had built her fortress. Now she would learn, through the long night, whether it would hold. The first night was a trial of faith against the cold. Outside, the world disappeared. There was no land, no sky, no creek, no town. There was only the white roar of it, the wind throwing itself against the stone walls again and again, searching, probing, feeling for any crack, any seam, any small failure it could pour itself through. It found none. Inside the small room, the 5 of them huddled together on the floor, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The baby slept against Marin's chest. Della had finally gone quiet, her thumb in her mouth. Jasper lay with his eyes half open, watching the orange glow of the brick in the iron, trusting it the way a child trusts a thing his mother has made. The stove threw off enough heat to keep the small room from freezing. But that was not the test. The test was happening out beyond the door. For hours, Marin had fed the fire, sending its warmth not into the room, but outward, toward the great stone. Now the fire was banked low, a single brick glowing to make the fuel last. And everything now depended on what the stone had taken in, on whether it had remembered. She waited. She let the children fall asleep one by one. The baby first, then Della. Then, at last, Jasper, his stubborn eyes losing the fight, his breath going slow and deep. And when they were all asleep, when there was no one left to be brave for, Marin rose. The cold of the stone floor came up through the soles of her worn boots like something alive. She crossed the small room, and she cracked open the rough timber door, and she stepped out into the vast roaring dark of the mill. The air out there was bitter, but it was not. She stopped. It was not the killing bitter of the air outside. There was a difference, subtle but real. A stillness here at the center of the great room. A faint and gentle pressure of something that was not cold. She walked toward the millstone, and she could feel it before she ever touched it. A warmth radiating into the dark around it. An aura of stored heat, soft and certain, like the warmth that comes off a stone wall at dusk after a long, bright day. Marin knelt before it, and she pressed her bare palm flat against its surface. It was not hot. It was warm, deeply, generously, patiently warm. It was the warmth of her father's hand over hers all those years ago. It was the sun, kept. It was a promise, made by a man long gone, and held in the cold heart of a stone, and now, at last, given back. Her throat closed, not from grief, from something else, something she had no name for. The feeling of a thing you believe turning, in your own hands, into a thing you know. The stone was breathing warmth back into the dark, building a shield of it around her sleeping children, blunting the worst of what the wind could do. It was working. Her father's voice, carried inside her for so many years, carried through her own girlhood and her marriage and her grief, was now, this night, holding her children's lives in its slow and steady grip. She returned to the small room. She sealed the door behind her, and she crossed to the wall where the one thing she owned that would never lie to her hung in the dark, the thermometer. She held the candle close. Outside, she knew, the cold had gone far past anything the glass could even measure. 20-30 degrees below the freezing line, with a wind that drove it deeper than any number could say. And inside this small stone room, warmed not by the dying fire, but by the patient breath of a great stone just beyond the door, the glass read 38. 38. It was not warm. It was not comfortable. But it was the number of the living. And in that moment, kneeling in the dark with the candle in her hand, Marin felt the fear go out of her. The deep, gnawing fear she had carried since the buggy stopped at her door. The fear that she had not saved her children, but only led them, with great cleverness, to a slower and lonelier kind of dying. That fear left her, and in its place came a thing harder and colder and far more useful. Certainty. They were not going to freeze. She looked at the three of them, asleep in the soft orange light. Jasper, Della, the baby, Asa. Their faces smoothed, untroubled, far away in whatever country sleeping children go to. And she thought of her father, not with grief this time, with something closer to gratitude and closer still to understanding, because she finally saw what he had spent his whole quiet life trying to show her. That survival was not luck. It was not prayer, and it was not passion, and it was not the loud and desperate strength the world imagined. It was attention. It was seeing the world for exactly what it was, a thing made of properties and forces and patient, unbreakable laws, and learning, with courage, how to set those laws beside you instead of against you. The town had a ledger. She had a stone, and the stone was older than the ledger and truer. And it did not care at all what the company had written about whose warmth belonged to whom. The hard nights would still come. The long rationing of food and fuel still lay ahead of her, and she did not pretend otherwise. But the question, the real question, the one beneath all the others, was answered. The stone would hold them. For 2 days, the storm went on without pause, and inside the stone walls, a small life found its rhythm. The day was for making heat. Marin would stoke the iron, feeding it her precious bricks, pouring the warmth into the great stone, watching the slow soak of it. And the children, who could not be allowed to sit idle and afraid in the cold, were given the work of survival. Jasper was given grain to grind with 2 smooth rocks into a coarse, rough flour. Della was given the task of mixing that flour with snowmelt into a thin, pale gruel. The baby was given to be loved and kept warm and watched, which was its own kind of work, and the most important kind, and Marin never once let it feel like less. They were cold. They were hungry. The gruel was thin, and the days were long, but they were alive. And on the 3rd day, the wind let go. The screaming stopped. A great and sudden silence fell over the valley, so total that it woke them. And through the one small eye of glass in the wall, a pale and watery light came in. The storm had passed. Marin unsealed the door and stepped out, and looked through the eye of glass at a world made strange. The drifts had swallowed everything. Out where the town should have been, only the tallest roofs broke the white, and the dark bones of the mine's head frame, and nothing else. A clean and terrible smoothness, as if the whole place had been quietly erased in the night. And it was into that silence that the first voice came, the crunch of someone struggling through the snow, and then a man's voice calling her name. Marin? Marin Wexler? She knew the voice. It belonged to the town's preacher, a gentleman named Hale, and there was a thing in it she recognized at once. It was the voice of a man who has come to find the dead. He came laboring up toward the mill on a crude pair of snowshoes, his face wrapped, his breath heaving white. He had come, she understood, on a grim and hopeless errand. He had come expecting to find 4 frozen shapes in a ruin. And then he stopped, because he had seen the smoke. A thin gray thread of it, rising steady from the iron pipe she had set in the wall. He stared at it the way a man stares at a thing his mind refuses to file. "Dear Lord," he breathed when she came out to meet him at the great door. Everyone thought you'd gone, or that you'd—" He could not finish it. His eyes moved past her, into the dim interior, to the great stone, to the orange glow of the iron heart in the sealed room beyond. He stepped inside, and he felt it. The air in there, still bitter, still hard, but changed. Different from the murdering cold outside in a way he could not explain. "How?" he said. "How are you? Warm." Marin looked at him, and she gave him the only answer there was, the whole truth of it, in 4 plain words. "The stone holds the heat," she said. He did not understand it. She could see that he did not. He was a good man, and a believing one, and what he had walked into did not fit inside anything he knew. He looked from her to the stone, to the children peering out from the warm room, and he shook his head slowly, the way a person does when the world has handed them something too large to hold. He left a little while later, still shaking his head, but he would carry what he had seen back down to the town, and that, though Marin did not know it yet, was the first seed of a story that would outlive them all. 2 hours later, a second figure came up through the snow, and this one did not call her name. This one came fast and hard and full of fury, and Marin knew who it was before she ever saw the dark, heavy coat. It was the man who ran the mine. He had seen the smoke too, from the window of his own house, down in the buried town, and he had not seen, as the preacher had, a miracle. He had seen a woman defying him. He had seen a fire burning in a building the company owned. He had seen, in that thin gray thread of smoke, an insult. He came through the great door without knocking, his face white with cold and colder rage. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice cracked off the stone walls. "You were told to vacate. You were given 5 days and money, and you were told to go." His eyes swept the room, the sealed chamber, the mud-packed walls, the repurposed iron, the great warm stone. And what he saw was not survival. What he saw was defiance. Marin did not step back. She was not anymore the still and quiet woman he had pronounced his sentence over in cabin number 7. That woman had been a wife and a tenant and an obstacle. This woman was the mistress of a stone fortress that he could not enter without her leave. "We are managing," she said. Just that. We are managing. And something in the simple steadiness of it, in the fact that she had not begged, had not wept, had not broken in the way his world required women like her to break. Something in that enraged him beyond his own understanding. His eyes fell on the children, huddled in the doorway of the warm room, and across his face passed a thing that was very close to hatred. Hatred of her competence. Hatred of the fact that she had taken his sentence, let the winter have her, and turned it, somehow, into this. He took a step closer, and he dropped his voice low to a thing that was almost quiet, almost gentle, which made it worse. "The company is not responsible for your welfare," he said. "You took your wages. You were told to leave." He looked slowly around the cold and patient room. "Whatever happens to you out here is on your own head now." He held her eyes. "Let the winter have you." And then he turned, and he pushed back out through the door, and down into the deep snow, and away. He had come expecting to find her broken or gone. He had found instead a strength he could not name and could not forgive. Marin watched him go until the white had swallowed him. Then she turned calmly, and she pulled the great door shut against the cold. The words did not touch her. "Let the winter have you." She had heard worse from kinder men, and she had a stone at the center of her world now that did not care what the man who ran the mine had decreed. The confrontation had changed nothing, and yet it had changed everything, because she understood now what she had become. Not a victim, not a problem the town could quietly erase. She was the one who had not gone, the one who had stayed and sealed the walls and pressed the dust into fire and woken the cold heart of the stone, while the whole town that had looked away from her lay buried and freezing in the dark below. She was the holdout, And winter, the real winter, had not even shown its full hand yet. Maren went back into the warm room, where her children waited in the soft orange light. She knelt by the stove. She set another brick to glow. And out beyond the door, in the dark, the great stone went on, giving back the warmth it had taken in. But the stone was no longer the only thing that had changed that winter. She had. The woman they cast out had become the one the cold could not reach. The lull was a lie. The valley had been quiet for 2 days. The sun had come up pale and thin over the drifts, and the world had lain still and white and almost gentle, and people down in their buried cabins had let themselves believe the worst of it was behind them. They were wrong. On the evening of the third still day, the sky began to change. It did not darken the way an ordinary night darkens, soft and gradual, one shade folding into the next. It went black all at once, a deep, starless, bottomless black, as if some great hand had drawn a heavy cloth across the whole of the valley and shut out every point of light. And down out of that blackness came the cold. A new cold. A deeper cold. A cold that made everything before it feel like nothing more than a warning. The wind came with it, but it came different this time. The first storm had searched. It had prowled the walls of the mill, probing, testing, looking for a way in. This new wind did not search. This new wind settled. It came down off the high peaks and lay over the valley like something enormous and patient that had decided to stay, and it pressed down on the world, and the cold pressed down with it. Past every line the people of that town had ever known, past every number they had a name for, and the valley closed. Slow and silent and complete, like a fist closing in the dark. Maren felt the change before she ever read it in the glass. She had stepped out of the warm room to check the great stone, the way she did every night, laying her bare palm against its surface to feel how deep the warmth had soaked, how much of it remained. And the air of the mill itself had told her something was wrong. Even here, behind walls thick as a man is tall, even with the iron heart glowing in the corner, and the stone breathing its slow, patient warmth into the dark. She could feel the weight of what was pressing in from outside. She crossed to the wall where the thermometer hung. She held the candle close, and the glass had fallen further than she had ever seen it fall, further than she had thought the glass could go. She did not let her face change. She had trained herself in that. A mother's face is a thing her children read before they can read anything else, and Maren had decided long ago on a cold road that hers would tell them only what she chose. So her face stayed still, but she went quietly to the ledge where the fuel bricks lay drying, and she counted them. She counted the flour by the cup. She counted the beans, and she did the same cold sums that ran on behind her eyes, night and day. How much heat, how much food, how many mouths, how many nights yet to come. The numbers were not kind, but the stone would hold. That much she knew, the way she knew her own name. The stone would hold. Whatever the glass said, whatever the wind did, the stone would hold. The rest she would have to manage. Out in the town, no one had a stone. What happened down in the buried town over the nights that followed did not happen all at once. The cold did not work that way. The cold was patient, And it was thorough, and it took what it took the way it had always taken, not in one great blow, but one small mistake at a time. A family at the north end of the town had not banked the foundation of their cabin properly before the snow came. A small thing. A few hours of work left undone in the rush before the first storm. And now the cold crept up through the floorboards, slow and certain as water finding a crack, and it settled into the chest of their youngest child. A deep, wet, rattling cough that would not leave. It grew worse in the dark hours, and there was nothing in that cold house with its cold floor that could drive it back out. The blacksmith, a man strong as the iron he had spent his life bending, burned through the last of his good dry wood, and then he began to burn green pine, because green pine was what he had left. And the green pine, full of sap and water, choked his chimney with a thick, black, greasy soot, and filled his home with a smoke that stung the eyes and lay heavy in the lungs, and gave back almost no warmth at all for the trouble of it. A young man went out into the white to fetch help for a sick wife. He knew the way. He had walked it 1,000 times, in every season, his whole life. But the storm had erased the world. The white had swallowed every shape that tells a person where they are. He lost the path between his own door and his neighbor's, and he wandered, and the cold took him. They found him in the morning. Not far at all from where he had started. Close enough that in clear weather, on an ordinary day, he might have called out and been heard. The town that had a company store and rows of company houses, and a company that owned the very mountain they all lived upon. That whole established, ordered, provided for town was failing. Not because its people were weak. They were not weak. They were as strong and as stubborn as people anywhere. But warmth used carelessly was no match for a cold this careful. And up the frozen creek, behind walls of granite, a woman who had been told to let the winter have her was warm. The contrast was the whole of it. Marin took no pleasure in it. There was nothing in her that wanted to, but she understood, with that same cold, clear sight that had carried her this far, exactly what the difference was. It was not luck. It was not favor. The winter had not looked down and chosen to spare her and to punish them. It was knowledge. It was a stone, and the patient art of waking it. It was a thing her father had handed to her so quietly, across so many ordinary afternoons, that she had carried it half her life without ever knowing it was the most valuable thing she would ever own. And knowledge, used with discipline, was turning out to be a truer kind of wealth than any wage the company had ever paid. The first knock came on one of the worst nights. The cold had deepened to a place that did not seem possible, the glass fallen past anything Marin had a word for, and she was sitting inside the warm room, mending a tear in Jasper's coat by the orange light of the iron heart, when the sound came. Not the wind. The wind she knew by now in all its voices. This was a fist on the great door. Slow at first, and then faster, and then frantic. She took her husband's axe, not to use it, but a woman alone with 3 children does not open a door in the dark without something in her hand. And she went to the entrance, and she called out over the howl of the wind. "Who's there?" A man's voice came back, broken and shaking with cold. "It's Vale. Gideon Vale. My wife. My boy. The roof's come down. Please. For God's sake. Maren knew the name. She knew the man. Gideon Vale was a proud and difficult man who worked the eastern part of the mine. There was a hardness in him, the kind of hardness that certain men carry their whole lives and mistake every day for strength. And he had been among those who watched her cast out into the cold and felt nothing. She remembered his face from that day, flat, untroubled, a man watching a thing that did not concern him. She unbarred the door. He stood there shaking, caked white with snow, and every scrap of that hardness was gone clean out of him. Behind him stood his wife, and in his wife's arms was a small boy, perhaps 4 years old, wrapped in a blanket far too thin for such a night, shaking so hard that the blanket trembled around him. Their roof had failed. The snow had built and built upon a cracked central beam until the beam gave way, and the whole crushing white weight of it had come down into their one room. It had put out their fire. It had buried what little shelter they had left, and they had fought their way up through the drifts in the killing dark to the one place in the whole valley they had heard was still warm. To her door. Maren looked at the man who had watched her eviction with a face like stone, and she felt nothing. And then she looked at the child, blue at the lips, shaking in his mother's arms, and there was no decision left to make at all. "Come in," she said, and she stepped back and she let them through. She brought them into the warm room. She sat them down by the iron heart, and from the pot she had just finished preparing, the thin gruel that was meant to be that night's supper for her own 3 children. She ladled out 3 bowls and gave them to the Vale family, and said nothing at all about whose supper it had been. The boy's mother spooned the warm food into him, slow and steady, and little by little his terrible shaking began to ease, and Maren watched her own 3 children watch their dinner go to strangers. She felt Jasper draw breath to speak. She laid her hand on his shoulder before the words could come, and the boy, that good boy, 7 years old and hungry, closed his mouth and said nothing. But Maren did not stop there, because she had learned a thing in the cold that the company never had. In all its years of owning the mountain, she would not be a place that simply gave. A place that only gives runs dry. And worse than that, a place that only gives turns the giver into a well, and the one who takes into a beggar, and it makes both of them into something smaller than they were. She had been made into a beggar once, at a company store, by a man who would not look at her, polishing a counter that was already clean, telling her the account was closed. She knew exactly what that did to a person. She would not do it to anyone, not even to a man who had felt nothing for her. So when the Vale family was warm and the boy was breathing easy, Maren took Gideon Vale aside, and she did not offer him pity. She offered him something better. She offered him work. She led him to the great soft drift of grain dust on the floor, and she knelt and she showed him how to mix it with snowmelt, how to press it tight and dense between his hands, how to lay the bricks out to dry. She put his cold, numb hands to the task. "This," she said, "is how we make the heat." And then she showed him the mud, and the dead grass, and the way she had packed it into every crack and seam. "And this," she said, "is how we keep it." She was not only giving him shelter for a night, she was giving him the thing itself, the knowledge the way to never again stand helpless before the cold with nothing in his hands. Because knowledge that saves only the one who holds it is knowledge poorly used. Her father had never said those words aloud, but he had lived them every day of his life. He had taught his daughter everything he knew, freely, holding nothing back, never once making a secret of it to keep her needing him. And now his daughter knelt in the dark of a ruin, teaching it forward to a man who had once felt nothing for her, because that was what the knowledge had always been for. Gideon Vale pressed his first brick with shaking hands, and something moved behind that hard, proud face that had not been there before. Word of the Vale family's survival spread the way only such news ever can. A rumor of salvation, passing from one freezing cabin to the next, whispered in the dark. There is a warm place. Up the creek, the old mill, the Wexler woman, the one they put out into the snow. And the next night, they came. The sick family from the North End, carrying their coughing child wrapped and limp between them. A widow named Brennan, her woodpile burned down to cold ash, her hands raw, her eyes hollow. They came one family at a time, struggling up through the drifts toward the single thin thread of smoke rising from the iron pipe in the wall, and Marin opened her door to every one of them, and the mill that had been her private sanctuary became something else entirely, a refuge. And with each new family that crossed her threshold, she did the same thing she had done for the Vales. She warmed them. She fed them from a store she knew in her bones would not stretch forever. And then, when they were warm and fed and able to stand, she taught them. She put the men to pressing bricks and sealing walls and hauling the great drifts of grain dust into piles. She set the women to grinding grain and melting snow for water and tending the sick ones laid out near the warmth of the stone and the great cold floor of the mill, silent and abandoned for 10 long years, filled now with the sounds of living, the scrape of grinding stones, the wet slap of pressed bricks, the coughing of the sick and the crying of cold children, and one quiet, steady, certain voice moving among them all, explaining again and again the patient secrets of stone and dust and still-trapped air. The woman the town had erased had become its anchor, the one everyone turned to, the proud miner and the helpless mother alike, the one whose voice, low and unhurried, was the thing that held the whole desperate room together. But a refuge has a cost. And the cost, Marin understood before anyone else in that room had even begun to fear it, would not be measured in cold. It would be measured in something thinner and quieter and far more frightening. It would be measured in food. She had carried flour up the creek to feed 3. There were a dozen mouths under that roof now, and more arriving with every dark night. The great sack that had bent her back climbing the frozen creek looked very small now, set against a room full of hungry families. She began to ration. She thinned the gruel, and then she thinned it again, until it was little more than warm, cloudy water with the memory of grain in it. She measured the flour by the handful, and then by the half-handful. She gave the largest portions to the children, and to the sick, and to the mothers who were nursing. And the smallest portion of all, the very smallest, she kept for herself, and for her own 3, who did not complain because their mother did not complain, And children learn courage the only way it can be learned, which is by watching someone they love be brave in front of them. And then came the night when the count came up short. A new family had stumbled in late, half frozen, with 2 small children who had not eaten in a full day. And there was not enough. There was simply not enough left in the pot. Maren stood over it, and she looked at the 2 starving little ones, and she looked at her own 3, who had at least eaten that very morning. And she made the choice that mothers have always made, in every cold place, in every hard season since the beginning of the world, the choice that breaks something deep inside you, even as you make it without a single moment's hesitation. She gave it to the ones who had less. Jasper watched his bowl pass into a stranger's hands. He was 7 years old. He was hungry, and he opened his mouth to speak, and then he closed it. And he looked up at his mother, and in that one quiet moment, he understood something that most grown men and women never come to understand in all their years. And he gave her a single small nod, and he said nothing at all. Maren turned away, so that her son would not see what was in her face. But the worst of the trouble, when it came at last, did not come from the cold, and it did not come from hunger. It came from a man. It came from Gideon Vale. Because hunger does a strange thing inside a frightened crowd. It does not always make people gentle with one another. More often, it does the opposite. It makes them turn. It goes looking for someone to blame and something to seize. And a hard, frightened man at the center of a frightened room can take all that fear and shape it into something far more dangerous than any winter. It began as whispers that the Wexler woman was holding back, that she fed her own children first, in secret, that the warmth of the great stone was not shared fairly, that the families lying close to it were warmer than the families pushed out toward the cold edges of the floor. None of it was true. But fear has never needed a thing to be true. It only needs the thing to be sayable. And Gideon Vale, who had come to her door shaking and begging, and who could not, in his pride, ever quite forgive himself for it. Gideon Vale found in those whispers a way to feel like a man again. He stood up one night in the cold center of the mill, and he said it out loud, where everyone could hear. "We ought to break it up," he said. "The stone, the fire, all of it. One heat for one family to hold over the rest of us. It isn't right. Every family ought to have its own. We split the fuel between us, fair and even. We each light our own fire. Each man looks to his own people, and no one stands over anyone." There was a murmur, a low, dangerous murmur. The murmur of frightened, hungry people hearing a thing that sounds, in the dark, an awful lot like fairness. And in that murmur, Maren heard the real test, not the cold. She had already beaten the cold. This frightened, hungry, well-meaning madness that would, if she let it run, tear apart with their own hands the one single thing keeping every living soul in that room alive, because the stone could not be broken up. That was the thing not one of them understood. The great stone worked because it was great, because all of its mass held the heat together as one body and gave it back slowly, evenly, to the whole room at once. Scatter that warmth into a dozen little fires across the freezing floor, each family hunched and hoarding over its own. And every one of those little fires would burn fast and burn out, and the cold would come pouring in through all the gaps between them. And then they would not lose a few. They would die one by one in the dark, each of them clutching their own small portion of a warmth that had only ever worked because it was shared. She could have shouted him down. She could have reminded the whole room that this was her mill, her stone, her fire, built with her hands out of her father's knowledge, and that they were alive because of her, and that they would do as she said, or they could go back out into the snow. She did none of that, because authority swung like a club only makes frightened people more frightened, and more certain they are right to be afraid. Myron stood up, and she spoke quietly, so quietly that the murmuring stopped, because people had to go still and lean in to hear her at all. "You're cold," she said. "You're scared. You're hungry. Every one of those things is real, and not a single one of you should feel any shame for it." She let that settle over the room. "But I want you to listen to me now. Not because this is my mill, because I'm telling you the truth. And the truth doesn't care one bit whose mill it is." She turned and she laid her bare hand flat against the great stone. "This is not warm because we light fires near it," she said. "It is warm because it is big, because all of it holds the heat together. One stone, one warmth, for every last one of us in this room." She looked slowly around the circle of frightened faces, lit orange and flickering in the dark. "You want to break it up. I understand why. It feels safer to hold your own peace in your own two hands, where you can watch it. I know that feeling better than anyone here." She paused. "But the very moment we break it up, the moment each family lights its own little fire and hoards its own little warmth, every one of those fires goes dark before morning, and the cold comes in, and we don't lose, some of us." She held the silence for a breath. "We lose all of us." The room had gone completely still. "The stone only works because we do not divide it," she said. "We are warm because we are not each of us alone in the dark. And the minute we forget that, the minute we decide it's every family for itself, we hand the winter the one thing it has been trying to take from us this whole time." Her voice dropped, soft now, almost tender. "It was never the cold that killed people up here. It never was. It's people turning away from each other. Believe me." She let that land. "I know that better than anyone in this room." And she looked just for a moment at Gideon Vale, not with anger, with understanding. "You came to my door," she said, quiet, meant for him, though the whole room heard every word. "And I never once asked you what you'd felt about me before, when you watched them put me out. I just let you in, because that is the only thing that works up here. It is the only thing that ever has." Gideon Vale stood very still. And then, slowly, the hardness in his face came apart. Whatever he had been gripping so tightly, the wounded pride, the shame he could not name, the need to be a man again in front of all these people, it gave way. It came off him the way the snow gives way and slides from a roof when the warmth finally reaches it from underneath. His shoulders dropped. His eyes went to the floor. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was not much. But from a man like that, in front of all of them, it was very nearly everything." And the murmur did not rise again. The danger passed out of the room like a held breath let go. The crowd that had been one bad moment from tearing itself to pieces settled back into something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it to last the night, and the next, and the one after that. Maren had not held them with her stone. She had held them with the truth that the stone only ever meant anything when no one tried to keep it for themselves. And the worst was still coming. On the last night, and the coldest of them all, when the glass had fallen to a depth that did not seem like a thing a body could live through, the final knock came upon the great door. Maren rose, and she went to it, and she called out, as she always did, but the voice that answered her stopped her where she stood. She knew it. She had heard it once before, in her own warm cabin, telling her that her husband was dead, and that she had 5 days, and that the company had met its every obligation to her. And she had heard it a second time, in this very mill, telling her to let the winter have her. It was the man who ran the mine. Maren opened the door. He stood there in the killing cold, and he was not the man who had come before. The heavy, dark coat was the same, but the man inside it was gone. His face was gaunt, scoured hollow. His arrogance had been stripped clean off him by the very same winter he had once wished upon her, and there was nothing left behind it but something hollow, and humbled, and small. Behind him stood his wife. And in his wife's arms, wrapped in fine fur but shaking, burning with a fever that the cold was deepening by the hour, was a small girl, his daughter. His house had failed him. Maren understood it at a glance. The company house, thrown up fast and cheap out of green unseasoned timber, built to look solid from the road and to keep no living soul warm. It had failed him, exactly as it had failed every other family in that town. The windows had iced over from the inside. The walls had bled the cold straight through. His fire had not been able to hold against the dark. And now his daughter was sick, and his money was worth nothing, and his rank was worth nothing, and all the laws and ledgers of the company were worth less than nothing against the older and truer law that a stone obeys, and a man can never bargain with. He had come to the one place left in the whole frozen valley. He had come to her, the man who had closed her account, the man who had set a small purse on her table, and called it her loss being met. The man who had looked at her 3 children in a warm cabin and told her to take them out into the snow and let the winter have them all. He stood at her door now, undone, and he could not speak. He could not find a single word in himself. His wife spoke for him. Her voice was barely there at all. "Please," she whispered. "Our little girl. She's so cold." And Maren stood in the doorway, the warmth of the great stone at her back, the killing cold at her face, and she looked from the shaking, feverish child to the broken man who had cursed her and her own children to die in that very cold. This was the moment. If there had ever in her life been a moment for it, this was the one. The winter had carried it right up to her door and laid it in her hands. A clean, complete, perfect revenge. She had only to say no. She had only to say back to him the very words he had said to her. "Whatever happens to you out here is on your own head. Let the winter have you." She had only to step back and pull the door shut and let the cold finish the very thing that he himself had wished upon her family. No one alive would have blamed her. Some, perhaps, would have called it justice and slept easy having called it so. Marin felt none of it. No triumph, no fury, not even the smaller, quieter wish to make him say the word sorry, or to stand there and watch him finally understand, all the way down, exactly what he had done. The winter had already passed a sentence on that man more complete and more terrible than any she could have spoken with her own mouth. There was nothing left for her to add to it. Nothing at all. There was only a sick child, and a cold night, and a thing her father had taught her without ever once saying the words out loud. She stepped aside. "Bring her in," she said. That was all. Bring her in. She led them to the warm room. She cleared a space near the Iron Heart between the Vale family and the widow Brennan, and she laid them all down together, as if there had never once been any difference between them at all. She gave the feverish child a bowl of the same thin gruel that every soul in that room was given. No more than the others. No less. And she gave up one of her own blankets, her own children's blanket, to wrap around the small, shaking girl, and that equal treatment, that and only that, was the whole of her judgment upon him. She would not punish him, and she would not forgive him in words either, because words were not the thing that mattered, and he had not earned them, and saying them would only have made the moment about her. And it was not about her. It had never been about her. She would simply treat his child exactly as she treated every other child beneath that roof, which was to say, she would save her. The man who ran the mine sat down on the cold stone floor, a little apart from the others, and he watched. He watched the woman he had cast out spoon-warm food into his daughter's mouth. He watched the fever begin, slow and grudging, to loosen its grip in the steady warmth of the stone he had told her to lie down and die beside. And he opened his mouth, once, to thank her, perhaps, or to say that he was sorry, or to say some other thing far too large and far too late for any of the small words a man knows how to use. But nothing came out. There were no words for it. There is no language made for that kind of reckoning, for sitting on a cold floor in the dark, alive only by the mercy of someone you tried your best to destroy, watching your own child breathe easier because of a warmth you had sneered at, given by a woman you had thrown out into the snow. So, he said nothing. He only watched, and he wept, quietly, in the orange light, in a way that no one in that whole crowded room remarked upon, because every last one of them understood it, and not one of them needed it explained. Outside, the winter threw itself against the granite walls, screaming, searching, furious, denied. And inside, the great stone held. It held the Vales, and the widow Brennan, and the coughing child from the north end of town. It held the man who ran the mine, and his wife, and his fevered daughter. It held Marin's own 3 children, all of them gathered together in the one single warmth that worked only because it had never once been divided. It held them the way it had been holding them all along. The way it would go on holding them, everyone, until the morning came. Patient, steady, remembering. The morning the winter let go, it did not creep away quietly. It broke. All at once, the wind that had screamed against the stone for so many endless nights simply stopped. And into the great silence it left behind came a light so clean and so enormous that it hurt to look at. The sun climbed over the eastern ridges and struck the buried valley full on, and every drift and every slope and every snow-laden roofline blazed white. A white so pure, so absolute, that the whole world seemed to have been made over in the night out of nothing but light. Inside the mill, the people woke slowly. They woke the way a person wakes after a long fever has finally broken, uncertain, blinking, almost afraid. They had grown so used to the howl of the wind that its absence felt like a held breath, like a fragile thing that might shatter if anyone dared to move too quickly. And then, one by one, they began to understand. It was over. The cold had spent itself at last. The siege had lifted. They were alive. Maren was the first to rise. She always was. She crossed the cold floor of the great room, past the family still huddled in their blankets, past the sleeping children, past the man who ran the mine and his wife, and the small girl whose fever had broken in the night. She went to the great door, and she set her shoulder against it, and she pushed it open against the weight of the drift that had built up there in the dark. And the light came pouring in. Maren stood in the doorway, and she looked out at the transformed valley, and for a long moment she did not move at all. The world was beautiful. It was a terrible kind of beautiful. The beauty of a thing that has tried, with everything it had, to kill you, and failed. But it was beautiful all the same. The bare aspens stood black against the blinding snow. The high peaks burned in the new sun, sharp and clean. And far below, where the buried town lay, the rooftops broke the white like the rounded backs of sleeping animals, and here and there, slow and thin and uncertain, threads of smoke had begun to rise. Some of those chimneys, she knew, would never smoke again. She made herself look at that. She did not turn away from it. The cold had taken its toll in the dark houses where the wood had run out and the walls had failed. And she would not pretend otherwise, not even to herself, not even on a morning like this one. But many of those chimneys would smoke again. Many of them. Because of a stone. Behind her, the room was coming awake. The murmur of voices, low and disbelieving. The small sounds of children stirring. The careful, halting sounds of people taking the slow measure of the fact that the night had passed, and they were still here to see the morning. And Maren stood in the doorway, breathing in the clean cold air, and something in her chest, something she had been holding clenched and tight for longer than she could rightly remember, loosened, just slightly, just enough to feel the difference. In the days that followed, the valley began the long work of digging itself out. The men of the mill went down first. They broke trail through drifts that stood higher than their heads, taking turns at the front where the work was hardest, and what they found in the town was hard in another way entirely. Not every door they reached opened to a living face. The cold had done what the cold does. In the quiet places where the fire had gone out and no one had come in time. But it had taken far less than it might have, because nearly a quarter of every soul who lived in that valley had spent the worst of the winter behind the stone walls of a ruin that a widow had been ordered to leave. They had lived, and every one of them knew exactly why. The story of the mill went through the valley faster than the men could shovel the roads clear. It passed from house to house, from survivor to survivor, and it grew surer and steadier with every telling. The Vale family told it. The widow, Brennan, told it, her eyes wet. The family from the north end of town, whose coughing child had pulled through against all odds, told it in broken voices that could barely get the words out. They told of the smoke where there should have been only silence and death. They told of the great stone that held the heat in its patient body. They told of the thin gruel shared out evenly, bowl by bowl, with never a thought to who deserved more. They told of the bricks pressed from nothing but the dust on the floor. And they told, above all, of the woman who had taken them in and warmed them, and who had then done a thing stranger and harder than simply keeping them alive. She had taught them how to keep themselves alive. The story did not need to be made any larger than it was. What had truly happened was already large enough. But there was one part that no one told in those first tellings, because no one but Maren had been there to see it. It happened on the third morning after the winter broke. The others had gone down to the town to help dig out the living and lay the dead to rest. The children were asleep, finally, deeply, the bottomless sleep of the safe. And Maren found herself alone in the great room of the mill, beside the stone that had carried them all through the dark. And there, with no one left to watch her, the thing she had held back for so long finally came. The grief. She had rationed it. From the very first morning, when a man in a heavy, dark coat had stood in her warm cabin and told her that her husband was gone. She had banked her grief down low, the way her father had taught her to bank a fire. She had not been able to afford it. There had been children to keep alive, and walls to seal, and a stone to wake, and then a whole crowd of strangers to save from the cold. Grief was a fire that took everything you fed it, and she had not had a single ember of herself to spare. So she had kept it. Through all those long and freezing nights, she had kept it banked and waiting, and she had not once let it have her. But the winter was over now. The children were safe. The strangers were saved. The stone would hold, and the danger had passed, and the long sums had finally come out in their favor. And so, alone in the great quiet room, in the soft light of the morning, Maren laid her hand flat against the warm granite, the very same way she had on that first impossible night, and she let the fire come. She wept. She wept for her husband, who had pushed open this very door a lifetime ago, and laid his own hand on this very stone, and smiled at her in the cool dust, and never once known what he was giving her with those few idle words. Solid rock, Maren. Takes a long, long time to change its mind. She wept for the walk up the creek that long ago Sunday, and the way he had reached over and taken her hand for no reason at all. She wept for all the small, ordinary moments she would never have again, and for all the ones she had not been able to feel in the cold, because feeling them would have cost her the strength she needed to live. She wept the way a person weeps only once or twice in a whole lifetime. The kind of weeping that comes up from somewhere far below the heart. And the stone was warm beneath her hand the entire time. It did not take the grief away. Nothing could have done that, and she did not ask it to. But it held her while the grief moved through her, the same way it had held her children through the longest nights. And when it was finally spent, when the last of it had passed through her and gone, and she sat back, hollow and emptied, on the cold floor, with her warm hand still pressed to the warm stone, she felt something she had not felt since the buggy stopped at her door. She felt like she could breathe again. The grief had not gone. She knew it never would, not entirely, but it had changed. It had moved from the frozen, clenched, unbearable thing it had been into something she could carry, something that had a place to live now, inside her, alongside everything else she was. That was the first true gift the winter gave her, in the end. Not survival alone. The room, at last, to grieve. When the roads had cleared enough for a man to travel them, the one who ran the mine came back up the creek. He came alone. His daughter had recovered. The fever had broken on that second night, in the steady warmth of the stone, and she was well now, and home, and safe in the world. He had not forgotten that. A man does not forget the night his child was handed back to him from the very edge of the dark. He came on foot through the softening snow, and he stood at the great door of the mill. And this time he did not push it open as if he owned it. This time he stood, and he waited to be asked. Maren came out to him. They stood for a long moment in the bright cold air. The two of them, the woman who had been cast out, and the man who had cast her. And she watched him struggle, the way he had struggled on that last terrible night, to find words for a thing that seemed to have none. But this time he found them. "I have spent my whole life," he said slowly, his eyes on the snow at his feet, "being a man who closed accounts." He turned his hands over, looking at them as though they belonged to a stranger. "I was good at it. I was proud of it. I told myself it was the same thing as being fair." He lifted his gaze to her face. "I was wrong. About all of it. And my little girl is alive this morning because you are a better person than I ever once bothered to be." Maren said nothing. She did not make it easy for him. She did not feel she owed him that. But she did not make it harder than it had to be either. She simply stood and let him say the thing he had climbed the creek to say. "I can't undo what I did," he went on. "I know that. There's no purse for this. There's no consideration I can set down on a table and call us even." His voice caught, and he had to stop and steady it. "But there's one thing I can do. And I came up here to tell you, to your face, that I mean to do it." And he told her he had written to the men who owned the mine, the distant men who had never set foot in the valley and never would. And he had told them the whole truth of what had happened here through the long winter. All of it. The eviction, the closed account at the store, the curse he had spoken at this very door to a freezing woman with 3 children at her back, and the stone, and the warmth, and the lives she had saved with it, including, in the end, the life of his own child. And then he had made them a single recommendation, that the old mill and every acre of land it stood upon be deeded over to Maren Wexler, outright, free and clear, forever. "It is not charity," he said quickly, before she could speak. "I need that understood between us. It is not the company being generous, or the company feeling sorry, or any such thing." His jaw tightened. "It's the company giving back something it took, to the person it should have belonged to all along. You made that ruin into the one thing in this whole valley that actually worked. It's yours. By any measure that matters, it was always going to be yours. I'm only the man whose name goes on the paper that finally admits it out loud." Maren looked at him for a long moment, And then she did a thing that surprised them both. She did not thank him, because to thank him would have been to call it a gift. And it was not a gift. And they both knew it. And a lie like that would have cheapened the one honest thing the man had ever offered her. So instead, she gave him a single small nod. The very same nod her son Jasper had given her on the night she handed his supper to a stranger's child. The nod that says, without a single word, "I see what you are doing. I see exactly what it costs you, and I will let you do it." "All right," she said. That was all. "All right." And something in the man's gaunt face came apart at those two small words. Not joy. He had no right to joy, and he knew it. It was something quieter and more painful than joy. It was the relief of a man who has been allowed just once, at the very end of a long, hard life of closing accounts, to do one decent and lasting thing. He had not been forgiven. He understood that. He understood that he likely never would be, not in the deep way that a man hopes to be forgiven, not in any way that would ever let him sleep entirely easy. But he had been given the chance to set right what little could be set right, and she had let him take it. For a man like that, it was more than he had any right to ask. He left a short while later, walking slowly back down the creek through the melting snow. A smaller figure than the one who had once stepped down from a buggy in a heavy coat and laid a small purse on a widow's table. The deed itself arrived by courier when the high passes opened weeks later in the full warmth of the spring. The man who ran the mine left the valley not long after. He was sent away to another mine in some warmer and softer place, far from the mountains. He and Marin never spoke again. There was nothing left to say between them, and they both knew it. And there was, in a strange way, a kind of peace in the knowing. But every year after that, when the first deep cold came sliding down off the peaks, a small crate would arrive at the mill, sent from somewhere far to the south, where the winters were gentle and brief. There was never a card inside it. There never needed to be. The crate was always full of oranges, bright and round, and impossibly warm in their color, glowing like small-held suns in the very heart of the cold. A man who had spent his life closing accounts, sending warmth every single winter to the woman who had taught him, too late, what warmth had been for all along. But the valley had not yet given her its last gift. That one would come years later, on a soft spring day. Walking up the creek toward her door on two small feet she would not, at first, recognize. Before that, though, there was a valley to rebuild. Spring came slowly to the valley, the way it always did up in those high places. And as the snow drew back off the slopes, and the creek shook off its ice and ran loud and bright again, the people of the town did a thing that no one had asked them to do, and no one had ordered. They came up the creek to the mill, not for shelter. The danger was long past. They came to work. They came with tools, and with timber cut from their own land, and with their own two hands. And they set about the long labor of turning the ruin that had saved them into something that would stand for generations. They repaired the fallen roof. They set proper glass into the empty window frames, real glass, clear and true, so that the light came pouring in where there had been only mud and dark. They built the small sealed room out into something that could truly be lived in, a real home, with a real hearth. and a floor that did not breathe the cold, and walls that held the warmth the way the great stone had taught them walls could. And at the very center of it all, untouched, they left the stone. It had earned its place. Not one of them would have dreamed of moving it. It sat in the heart of the rebuilt mill the way a heart sits in the center of a living body. Quiet, patient, giving, season after season, the warmth it had taken in. But the rebuilding of the mill, in the end, was the smallest part of what that winter had changed, because the people who had survived inside those walls had learned something there. In the cold and the dark, with their lives hanging on it, they had learned the secret of the stone, and they did not keep it. That was the thing Maren had truly taught them. Not just how to press the bricks and seal the walls and wake the slow heat in the granite. She had taught them, by every action of those long nights, that a warmth held too tightly stops being warmth at all. That the only things worth keeping are the ones you are willing to give away. She had taught it not with lectures, but with her own raw and aching hands, taking in one freezing family at a time and showing each of them, patiently, how never to be helpless before the cold again. And so they carried it forward. All through that spring and into the summer, the cabins of the valley began to change. The people who had been at the mill went to their neighbors who had not, and they showed them how to build a great stone into the very heart of a home. A thermal heart, a battery against the killing cold, a thing that would take the quick heat of a small fire and give it back slow and steady through the longest nights, so that no family in that valley would ever again have to choose between a fire that burned too fast and a winter that lasted too long. One stone at a time, the whole valley learned to hold the heat, and a kind of ritual grew up around the work, though no one ever quite decided it. Each autumn, when the first cold breaths came down from the peaks, the valley would gather, home by home, to seal the walls together and press the winter's bricks side by side. The children running underfoot, the old ones telling stories. The hardest season's work had somehow become the year's warmest gathering, and it had begun in a ruin, on the worst night of a widow's life. The next winter, when the cold came down off the peaks again, hard and deep, not a single soul was lost. Not one. The man who ran the mine had been wrong about a great many things, but he had been most wrong about this one. He had believed that warmth was a thing you owned and rationed and closed the account on. He had believed it could be taken from a person the way a house could be taken, or a wage withheld, or a family put out into the snow. He had never once understood that warmth, when it is shared, does not run out. It multiplies. The children grew up inside that truth, and it shaped every one of them. Jasper, the boy who had watched his own supper pass into a stranger's hands and said nothing. Jasper grew into a builder. He became known all through the valley and far beyond it for houses that were sturdy and warm, houses with great stones at their hearts, houses that held a family safe and warm through any winter the mountains could throw down at them. People used to say that his houses had a kind of patience built right into the walls. They were not wrong about that. He had learned patience young, in a sealed stone room, watching his mother feed a fire and trust a stone. It never left him. Della, the girl who had lined up her smooth stones on the floor and named each one under her breath while the world ended outside. Della grew into a healer. She came to understand, better than anyone, the deep and quiet bond between warmth and health, between a body kept safe from the cold and a body that had the strength left to mend itself. She had learned it as a small girl, in the orange light, watching a stranger's fever break in the warmth of a stone. She carried that understanding to every sickbed she ever sat beside for the rest of her long and gentle life. And the baby, Asa, the one Marin had carried up the frozen creek, bound tight against her chest, far too young to keep a single memory of any of it. Asa grew up to take over the mill itself. When the water rights to the creek came back, in the fullness of time, it was Asa who set the great wheel turning again, and the mill ground flour once more, for the whole valley, exactly as it had been built to do, long ago, by men who knew how to make a thing that lasts. The mill that had been a tomb became a home, and the home that had been a refuge became, in the end, a working mill again. And the great stone at the center of it went on doing the one thing it had always known how to do, holding the heat, keeping the promise, season after patient season. The years moved on, the way years always do. The deep winter, the one that had begun with a knock on a cabin door and a small purse set down upon a table, became the winter against which every other winter would forever be measured. People spoke of it for the rest of their lives. They told their children about it on cold nights by the fire, and those children told their own children, and somewhere along the way, the story stopped being a thing that had merely happened once to certain people, and became instead a thing the valley knew about itself, a thing that was true of who they were, that when the very worst comes, you do not turn away from one another, you turn toward. Gideon Vale lived a long life and a deeply changed one. The hardness that had nearly torn the whole mill apart on its worst and most desperate night never fully returned to him. He had pressed his first brick with shaking hands. He had stood up in a frozen room and said something cruel and frightened out of his own shame and his own fear. And he had been met in that moment, not with anger, but with understanding. It remade him, root and branch. He became, in his later years, one of the gentlest men in the whole valley. He was always the first to a neighbor's door when trouble came calling. He taught the stone heating to anyone who asked him, and to a good many who never thought to ask. And he told the story of that winter at the mill more often than anyone else alive, always ending it the very same way. "She let me in," he would say, his rough old voice going rougher still. "After everything I did, after the way I looked at her, the day they put her out and felt nothing. She just opened the door and she let me in." He never once managed to tell that part with a steady voice, not in all his years. The town below changed too. The people who had learned, in a stone ruin, that no one survives the cold alone, carried that lesson home with them. They turned outward more, and the whole place grew, slowly, into somewhere a little warmer than it had any right to be, given the cold it sat in. And at the quiet center of all of it, though she never sought the place, and would have laughed to hear it said, was Marin. She never left the mill. She lived out her long years inside the very walls that had held her, beside the very stone that had saved her, in the home that she and her children and the whole grateful valley had built up, board by board and stone by stone, out of a roofless ruin, She grew old there. Her hair went gray and then white, and the fine lines that the first cold morning had begun to write at the corners of her eyes deepened, over the years, into the soft and folded creases of a face that had, in the end, laughed far more than it had ever wept. For she did laugh in those later years. That was the thing the people who came to know her best always remembered most. Not the grim, still frozen-faced woman from the worst of the winter. By the time most of the valley came to know her, she had become something far warmer than that. A woman quick to laugh and slow to judge. A woman with a deep stillness in her that was no longer the stillness of grief held back by force, but the easy, settled stillness of a person who had made her peace with what the world was and had found, somewhere inside that peace, a great and surprising amount of room for joy. She kept her door open. That was the thing she was known for. More than the stone, more than the legend, more than any of it. Her door was always open. Anyone could come. The cold, the lost, the grieving, the young, the old. A child with a scraped knee, a widow with nowhere to turn, a traveler caught out by the weather. They came to the mill and the door opened, and there was always something warm to drink, and a place by the stone, and a woman who would sit and listen for as long as you needed her to. She had been turned away once in the cold by a whole town that looked the other way. And she had decided, somewhere on a frozen creek with a baby bound to her chest, that no one who ever came to her door would be turned away again. She kept that promise her whole life long. And one spring, when she was very old, a young woman came to the mill. A stranger. She came up the creek on a fine soft day, with the aspens just beginning to unfurl their new green leaves and the water running high and bright over the stones. And she stood before the door of the mill a long, long moment before she knocked, as if she were gathering something up inside herself first. Maren came to the door, the way she always did, and the young woman looked at her, and her eyes filled all at once, and for a moment she could not speak at all. "You won't remember me," she finally managed. "I was very small, hardly more than a baby. There was a winter, a terrible winter, and my father carried me up here through the snow, in the worst of it." Her voice shook. "I was sick. I was burning up with a fever, and you took me in. You gave me your own blanket, off your own children. You spooned warm food into my mouth with your own hands, and you saved my life. And you had every reason in the whole world not to." Maren went very still. The girl, the feverish girl, wrapped in fur, shaking in her mother's arms at the door, on the coldest and cruelest night of all. The daughter of the man who had closed her account and cursed her family, and come crawling back up the creek when the winter finally broke him. That child was a grown woman now, and she had come back. "My father told me," the young woman said, "years later, before he died. He told me everything. What he did to you, what he said at this door, and what you did for us anyway, after all of it." She wiped at her streaming eyes. "He said you were the finest person he ever knew in his life. He said he spent every year after that winter trying to be just a little more like you, and that he never once managed it." A small, broken laugh escaped her. "The oranges. He sent the oranges. Every winter, all those years. Did you ever know that it was him?" "I knew," Maren said softly. "He wanted you to know that they were thank yous," the young woman said. every single crate, for every year of my life that I got to have because of you. He never could bring himself to say it to your face. He told me the words all felt too small for it. He said there were no words big enough, so he sent the oranges instead, and hoped you'd understand. And then the young woman reached out, and she took Marin's old, worn hand in both of her own, the way a person holds something precious and fragile, and she pressed it tight. I came to say what he never could, she said. Thank you for my whole life, for every single day of it. Thank you. Marin looked at her for a long, long moment, at the living, breathing, grown and healthy woman standing in her doorway in the warm spring sunlight. The woman who would not have been standing there at all, who would have been nothing but a small frozen shape in a failed company house, if one widow had said the word no on the coldest night of her life. And Marin did not weep this time. She had done her weeping long ago, alone, in the dark, with her hand pressed flat against a warm stone. What she felt now was something quieter and deeper and far harder to hold in a single heart. It had no name. It was something like the feeling of a circle closing, something like the feeling of understanding, at the very end, exactly what a whole life had been for. She reached out, and she drew the young woman gently in. Come inside, she said. Come and sit a while by the stone. There's warmth in it still, even on a fine day like this one. She smiled, and for just a moment, all the long years seemed to fall away from her face. There's always warmth in it, if you know how to ask. And she led the daughter of the man who had cast her out into the home that his own cruelty had, in the strangest and most roundabout way, helped her to build. She sat the young woman down beside the great patient stone. She gave her something warm to hold in her hands, and the two of them sat together in the soft light, and they talked for a long, long time, while the spring afternoon moved slowly across the floor. That was the thing the winter had truly given her, in the end. Not the deed to the land, not the legend that outlived her, not even the long, warm peace of her later years. It had given her this, a door she could open, a warmth she could share, a life built not out of what had been taken from her in the cold, but out of what she had chosen, over and over again, every single time, to give freely away. She had walked up that frozen creek, a widow, cast out, 3 small children at her back, and a purse that would not last a week, carrying nothing in all the world but a thing her own father had handed her so quietly that she had not even known she held it, and she had turned it into a home that warmed a whole valley. She had taken the very worst thing the world had ever done to her, and she had made it, with her own 2 hands, into the very best thing she ever did. Marin lived to be very old. She died in the end on a mild and gentle evening in the spring, in her own bed, in the stone house that had saved her. Her children were near her when she went, her grandchildren too. The valley she had warmed went on warming itself, in the way she had taught it, long after she was gone, and longer still, and the great stone sat in the heart of the mill where it had always sat, patient and unmoved through all the turning years, holding, for anyone who came and laid a hand upon it, the slow and steady warmth that it had taken so very long to gather, and given so freely, and never once in all that time kept back for itself, the way she had taught it. the way her father had taught her. The way in the end, the only things that ever truly last are the ones passed from one open hand into another, warming the world and the people in it, long after the hands that first gave them have gone still. And on cold nights, even now, the people of that valley keep a stone at the heart of every home, not because they fear the winter, but because a woman once showed them that the surest way through the dark and the cold is together, and that no one who comes to your door ever should be left out in it alone.